I opened my eyes to sterile white walls and the steady beep of machines, thinking I'd been asleep for just one night. The nurses exchanged worried glances when I asked about Derek, my husband of 12 years. Mrs. Harper, Dr. Vance said, gently, "You've been in a medically induced coma for 8 months, but that wasn't the devastating part. The devastating part came when I discovered Derek had remarried, not once, but twice during my unconsciousness, convinced I would never wake up. Both ceremonies were legally invalid, since I was still very much alive, and very much still his wife. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The fluorescent lights above my hospital bed hummed with an intensity that made my newly awakened eyes water. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life through a fog that refused to lift. 8 months. The words kept echoing in my mind, as Dr. Vance explained what had happened during my absence from the world. A drunk driver had run a red light on a rainy Tuesday evening in March, sending my car spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before it wrapped around a telephone pole. The impact had caused severe traumatic brain injury, and doctors had placed me in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling and give my brain time to heal. "Your recovery is nothing short of miraculous," Dr. Vance continued, her kind eyes crinkling at the corner. "We weren't certain you would wake up at all, let alone with such clear cognitive function." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Has anyone contacted your family yet? Your emergency contacts show your husband Derek Whitman as primary." The mention of Derek's name should have brought comfort, but something in the doctor's hesitation made my stomach clench. "He doesn't know I'm awake yet," I managed to say, my voice hoarse from months of disuse. "Could you call him? I'd like to see him." Vance and Nurse Rodriguez exchanged another one of those loaded glances that made me feel like everyone knew something I didn't. "Of course," Dr. Vance said slowly. "We'll reach out to him right away. In the meantime, let's focus on your physical therapy evaluation. You've been unconscious for a significant period, and we need to assess your motor functions." The next few hours passed in a blur of tests, questions and gentle exercises designed to gauge how much my body had forgotten during its long sleep. It wasn't until the evening shift arrived that Nurse Rodriguez approached my bed with a tablet in her hands and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Harper, I know this might seem strange, but would you like to see some photos from while you were..." Sometimes it helps patients orient themselves to how much time has passed. She showed me images of the changing seasons outside my hospital window, of construction projects that had been completed in the city, of new businesses that had opened in our neighborhood. Then she hesitated before swiping to the next photo. "This appeared on your husband's social media account about 6 weeks ago." The image on the screen made my blood freeze in my veins. Derek stood in a garden setting, wearing a navy blue suit I'd never seen before, his arm around a petite brunette in an elegant cream-colored dress. She was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of effortless beauty that belonged in magazines. They were both smiling radiantly, surrounded by what appeared to be wedding guests, throwing flower petals. "I don't understand," I whispered, my hands trembling as I took the tablet from her. The caption read, "Finally married my soulmate, Cassandra Blake. Couldn't be happier to start this new chapter together. New beginnings, love wins. Mrs. Whitman." Nurse Rodriguez sat on the edge of my bed, her voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Harper, there's more. This was posted 6 weeks ago, but there was another ceremony about 3 months ago. A smaller one, according to the posts we found." She swiped to show me another set of photos, these taken in what looked like a courthouse setting. Derek and the same woman, this time with just a few witnesses present. The room spun around me as the implications sank in. "But I'm not dead," I said stupidly, as if stating the obvious would somehow make this nightmare make sense. "We're still married. How can he be married to someone else? Legally, he can't," Nurse Rodriguez explained. "Both ceremonies would be invalid because your marriage to him was never dissolved. You were declared missing and presumed dead after 6 months, but that's not the same as a legal death certificate." The court proceedings were still ongoing when he apparently decided to move forward anyway. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. While I had been fighting for my life in this hospital bed, connected to machines that breathed for me and kept my heart beating, Derek had been building a new life with another woman. Not just dating or moving on, but actually going through wedding ceremonies, posting joyful announcements on social media, playing house with someone who had no idea she wasn't legally his wife. Does she know? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. This Cassandra person, does she know about me? Nurse Rodriguez shook her head. From what we can gather from the social media posts, it doesn't appear so. She seems to genuinely believe she's married to him. She's been posting photos of their home, their travels, even talking about planning for the future together. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through 12 years of marriage, searching for signs I had missed. Derek and I had met in college, both ambitious and driven. He was studying business while I pursued marketing, and we seemed like the perfect power couple. After graduation, we'd moved to Millbrook, an affluent suburb of Connecticut, where Derek quickly established himself in real estate development, while I climbed the corporate ladder at a prestigious marketing firm. Our life had been comfortable, predictable, successful by all external measures. We had the beautiful colonial house with the perfectly manicured lawn, the luxury cars, the expensive vacations documented in carefully curated social media posts. I had thought we were happy, or at least we'd talked about children someday, when the timing was right, when our careers were more established, when we had more financial security. There was always some reason to wait. Looking back now with the clarity that comes from having your world completely shattered, I could see the cracks that had been there all along. Derek's increasing focus on his business and social status, the way conversations about my career ambitions were met with polite disinterest or subtle discouragement, how he had gradually taken control of our finances, our social calendar, even our future plans, always with reasonable explanations that made me feel selfish for questioning him. But even with all of that, I never could have imagined this level of betrayal. To not just move on while I was unconscious and fighting for my life, but to actively celebrate with not one but 2 wedding ceremonies, to post triumphant announcements as if I had never existed at all. The next morning brought Dr. Vance with more devastating news. Mrs. Harper, we attempted to contact your husband yesterday evening, and again this morning. The phone number we have on file has been disconnected. We tried the address as well, but it appears the house has been sold. We're working with hospital administration to locate current contact information. Sold. Our house, the one we had chosen together, decorated together, where we had planned to build our future, had been sold while I was unconscious. I felt like I was disappearing, like every piece of evidence that Natalie Harper had ever existed was being systematically erased. What about my job? I asked, dreading the answer. Dr. Vance consulted her tablet before responding. According to our records, your employer initially held your position, but after 4 months with no improvement in your condition, they had to fill the role permanently. Your benefits continued through Cobra for a while, but she trailed off, and I understood. My health insurance had lapsed. My job was gone. My husband had remarried. My house had been sold. In the span of 8 months, I had lost everything that defined my identity as Natalie Harper, successful marketing executive and devoted wife. The woman who had been carefully building a perfect life in Millbrook, Connecticut, no longer existed in any meaningful way. Hospital social worker Margaret Chen arrived that afternoon with a stack of papers and a sympathetic expression that I was beginning to recognize as the universal look people gave to those whose lives had completely imploded. Miss Harper, I know this is an overwhelming time, but we need to discuss some practical matters. Your insurance situation, living arrangements upon discharge, financial resources. The conversation that followed was brutal in its clinical efficiency. Without active insurance, my continued stay at the hospital was becoming financially impossible. The medical bills from 8 months of intensive care were already astronomical. I had some savings from before the accident, but nowhere near enough to cover the costs or support myself long-term while I figured out what came next. Do you have family members who might be able to help? Margaret asked. I shook my head. My parents had died in a plane crash 5 years earlier, and I was an only child. Derek's family had never particularly warmed to me, always treating me like an outsider who had somehow convinced their golden boy to settle down. His friends were really his friends, people I had socialized with as his wife, but never developed independent relationships with. The isolation was complete and terrifying. I had spent 12 years building a life that was entirely dependent on Derek and our marriage, and now I was discovering just how precarious that foundation had been. There are some options, Margaret continued. Transitional housing programs, disability assistance while you recover, legal aid services to help you navigate the situation with your husband's remarriage. It's not ideal, but there are pathways forward. That evening, alone in my hospital room with only the steady beep of monitoring equipment for company, I forced myself to look at more of Derek's social media posts. The photos told the story of a man who had seamlessly transitioned from one life to another. There were romantic dinner dates with Cassandra just 3 months after my accident, weekend getaways to places Derek and I had talked about visiting but never found time for, home renovation projects in what appeared to be a new house, with Cassandra playing the role of devoted partner that I had once filled. The posts were filled with comments from people I recognized, friends and colleagues who had been part of our social circle. Everyone seemed to know about the new relationship, the weddings, the new life Derek was building. No one mentioned me. It was as if I had been completely erased from their collective memory, edited out of the story of Derek's life with surgical precision. One post in particular made my hands shake as I read it. Posted just 2 weeks earlier, it showed Derek and Cassandra at what appeared to be a housewarming party. The caption read, "So grateful for my beautiful wife and the amazing new chapter we're writing together. After everything I've been through, I never thought I'd find this kind of happiness again. Sometimes life has to tear everything down before it can build something better." After everything he'd been through, as if my near-death experience and months-long coma had been something that happened to him, an obstacle he'd had to overcome rather than a tragedy that had befallen his wife. The narcissism was breathtaking, and I wondered how I had never seen it so clearly before. But the post that truly broke me was from Cassandra's account, shared just days before I woke up. It was a photo of her hand wearing what looked like my engagement ring, the same unique vintage setting Derek had chosen for me all those years ago. The caption read, "Wearing my grandmother-in-law's ring today, and feeling so connected to Derek's family history, she would have loved us together." Grandmother-in-law. Derek had given her my ring, and created an entire fictional backstory about it belonging to his grandmother, who had actually been buried with her own jewelry years before Derek and I even met. The casual cruelty of it, the elaborate lies he'd told this innocent woman, made me realize I was dealing with someone I had never truly known at all. Dr. Vance found me crying that night, the tablet still clutched in my hand. She sat beside my bed and waited patiently while I tried to compose myself enough to speak. "I don't understand how someone can just disappear. I finally managed. How 12 years of marriage can be erased like I never existed." "You didn't disappear," she said firmly. "You survived something that should have killed you. You fought your way back from a place most people never return from. That's not disappearing, Natalie. That's resurrection. And what your husband did while you were fighting for your life says everything about who he is, and nothing about who you are or what you're worth." Her words provided a small spark of warmth in the cold reality of my situation, but they couldn't change the practical problems I was facing. I was about to be discharged from the hospital with nowhere to go, no job, no support system, and mounting medical debt that would follow me for years. The life I had carefully constructed over more than a decade was completely gone, and I had no blueprint for building something new from the wreckage. Margaret returned the next morning with more information about my options. There was a transitional living facility about an hour away that could provide temporary housing while I got back on my feet. It wasn't ideal, but it would give me time to figure out next steps. There was also the matter of Derek's bigamous marriages, which were clearly illegal and gave me grounds for various legal actions if I chose to pursue them. "The question is," Margaret said, "what do you want to do? Do you want to fight for your share of the assets from your marriage? Do you want to pursue legal action against your husband for fraud or bigamy? Do you want to contact this Cassandra woman and inform her that her marriages are invalid? These are decisions only you can make, but you don't have to make them right now. The priority is getting you stable and safe first. As I considered my options, I realized that for the first time in my adult life, I was facing choices that were entirely my own. Not decisions made jointly with Derek, not compromises designed to maintain peace in our marriage, not careful calculations about how my choices would affect our shared image or goals, just me, deciding what I wanted my life to look like going forward. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I had no idea who Natalie Harper was when she wasn't Derek Whitman's wife, successful marketing executive, or resident of prestigious Millbrook. But maybe, in the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life, there was an opportunity to discover something authentic for the first time. That night, as I prepared for what would be my last evening in the hospital, I made a decision that surprised even me. I wouldn't contact Derek immediately. I wouldn't pursue him for assets or revenge, at least not yet. Instead, I would take the time I needed to figure out who I was supposed to be, and then I would decide how to handle the wreckage of my old life, from a position of strength rather than desperation. Margaret had mentioned some programs in other states, places designed specifically for people rebuilding their lives after major trauma. One in particular had caught my attention, a residential program in Sedona, Arizona, that combined therapeutic services with vocational training in creative art. It was far from Connecticut, far from Derek and Cassandra, and the life that had been built on top of my unconscious body. I want to go to Arizona, I told Dr. Vance during her final rounds, the program in Sedona. I want to start completely over, somewhere no one knows the old version of me. She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her since I'd awakened. I think that sounds like exactly what you need, she said. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, Natalie, and I have a feeling you're going to live very well indeed. As I drifted off to sleep that final night in the hospital, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The woman who would board that plane to Arizona in 3 days wasn't the same woman who had been driving home from work on that rainy Tuesday evening 8 months ago.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That woman was gone forever. But maybe, just maybe, the woman who was emerging from the wreckage would be someone worth becoming. The airplane wheels touched down at Phoenix Sky Harbor just as the desert sun was painting the mountains in shades of orange and purple I'd never seen in Connecticut. Everything about Arizona felt foreign to my Connecticut-trained senses, from the dry heat that hit me like opening an oven door, to the vast expanse of sky that seemed to stretch infinitely in every direction. The shuttle ride to Sedona took 2 hours through landscape that looked more like another planet than anywhere I'd ever imagined living. Red Rock Healing Center sat nestled against towering sandstone formations that glowed like fire in the late afternoon light. The facility itself was modest, a collection of adobe-style buildings connected by covered walkways and surrounded by native desert plants that somehow thrived in this harsh environment. Nothing about it resembled the sterile institutional setting I'd expected. It felt more like a retreat, a place where people came to find themselves rather than to hide from the world. My intake counselor was a woman named Susan Martinez, probably in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of deep tan that came from years of desert living. Her office was filled with pottery, paintings and woven textiles that she explained had been created by previous residents of the program. "We believe in the healing power of creating something with your hands," she said, noticing my interest in the artwork. "Most people who come here have had their sense of identity shattered in some way. Making art helps rebuild that connection to yourself." My room was simple but comfortable, with a small kitchenette and a window that looked out toward Bell Rock, one of Sedona's famous red rock formations. The silence was absolute in a way I'd never experienced. No traffic sounds or neighbor noises or the constant hum of urban life. Just the occasional call of a bird and the whisper of wind through the desert vegetation. That first night, the quiet felt oppressive, almost frightening after months of hospital sounds and years of suburban background noise. The program at Red Rock was unlike anything I'd encountered before. Mornings began with meditation and gentle yoga, activities that felt foreign to someone whose previous exercise routine had consisted of high-intensity gym sessions designed to maximize efficiency. Rachel Winters, the program director, explained that trauma survivors often lived in a state of hypervigilance, their nervous systems constantly preparing for the next crisis. "We need to teach your body that it's safe to relax," she said during our first session together. The therapeutic component combined traditional talk therapy with expressive arts, including painting, sculpture, music, and creative writing. I'd never considered myself artistic, had always dismissed such activities as hobbies for people who had time to wait. Derek had reinforced this attitude, often joking about arts and crafts when I occasionally showed interest in creative pursuits. But here, surrounded by other people rebuilding their lives from various types of wreckage, creativity felt less like frivolity and more like necessity. My first attempt at painting was laughably bad, a muddy landscape that bore no resemblance to the stunning vistas surrounding us. Maria Santos, the art therapy instructor, looked at my frustrated expression and smiled. "You're trying to paint what you think you should see instead of what you actually see," she observed. "That's a common problem for people who've spent years living according to other people's expectations. Try closing your eyes and just feeling the brush on the canvas." The exercise felt ridiculous at first, but something shifted when I stopped trying to create something recognizable and just let myself play with color and texture. The painting that emerged was abstract, chaotic, filled with angry reds and deep blues that seemed to capture something I couldn't yet put into words. When I stepped back to look at it, tears started flowing unexpectedly. "That's the first honest thing I've created in years," I whispered to Maria, surprised by the truth of the statement. The other residents became my first real community in ways I hadn't anticipated. There was James, a former military contractor dealing with PTSD after an explosion in Afghanistan. Patricia, a widow whose husband's sudden death had revealed decades of financial fraud that left her homeless and facing criminal charges. Miguel, a recovering addict whose family had cut all contact after years of broken promises and stolen trust. We were all rebuilding from different types of devastation, but the common thread of starting over from nothing created bonds that felt more genuine than many of the friendships I'd maintained in my previous life. Evening conversations on the center's patio became sacred time, a place where we could share our stories without judgment or advice, just witness each other's pain and progress. It was during one of these sessions that I first spoke aloud about Derek's betrayal, describing the surreal experience of waking up to discover I'd been completely erased from my own life. The group listened without trying to fix anything or offer platitudes, just holding space for the enormity of what I'd experienced. "The worst part isn't even that he remarried," I found myself saying one evening as we watched the sunset paint the rocks in impossible shades of pink and gold. "It's that he made it seem like I never existed at all, like 12 years of marriage could just be deleted and replaced with someone newer and more convenient." James nodded, understanding written across his weathered features. "That's what trauma does," he said quietly. "It makes you disappear from your own life, even when you're still breathing." After 6 weeks at Red Rock, I felt strong enough to begin venturing into Sedona proper. The town was unlike anywhere I'd ever lived, a strange mix of spiritual seekers, wealthy retirees, tourists and artists who'd been drawn by the dramatic landscape and the creative community that had grown up around it. My first stop was the Clay and Fire Pottery Studio in the Arts District, a recommendation from Maria who thought I might enjoy working with ceramics. The studio was housed in a converted warehouse with huge windows that let in streams of desert light. The owner, Rosa Delacroix, was a woman in her 60s with calloused hands and clay permanently embedded under her fingernails. She wore her gray hair in a long braid down her back and had the kind of presence that made you immediately trust her judgment. When I explained that I was a complete beginner interested in trying pottery, she simply handed me an apron and pointed toward a potter's wheel. "Don't think," she instructed as I sat down at the wheel for the first time. "Thinking is what got you into whatever trouble brought you here in the first place. Just feel the clay and let it tell you what it wants to become." The advice sounded like New Age nonsense to my rational mind, but something about Rosa's matter-of-fact delivery made me willing to try. The clay felt alive under my hands, responsive and unpredictable in ways that reminded me why I'd been drawn to art therapy. Unlike the spreadsheets and marketing campaigns that had filled my working life, clay didn't lie or perform or try to impress anyone. It simply was what it was, and working with it required a kind of presence I'd forgotten was possible. My first attempts collapsed spectacularly, shapeless blobs that bore no resemblance to the elegant vessels I'd imagined create. Perfectionism is the enemy of creativity, Rosa observed, watching me stare in frustration at my latest failure. And judging by that expression, perfectionism has been running your life for quite a while. She was right, of course. I'd spent years trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect employee, the perfect resident of Millbrook with the perfect house and the perfect image. All that perfection had crumbled the moment I was no longer conscious to maintain it. Rosa's business partner Tommy Sullivan turned out to be a former corporate lawyer who'd walked away from a prestigious Manhattan firm after a heart attack at 45. He understood something about leaving behind a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow at the core. I spent 20 years billing 18-hour days and calling it a career, he told me one afternoon as we loaded pottery into the kiln. Took nearly dying for me to realize I'd never actually been living. The studio became my second home over the following month. I started spending entire days there, first taking classes and then, gradually being trusted with more responsibility as my skills developed. Rosa had a way of teaching that felt more like collaboration than instruction, offering guidance when needed, but allowing students to discover their own relationship with the clay. The work was physical in a way my previous career had never been, requiring strength and stamina that I had to build gradually. My hands, which had once been manicured and soft from desk work, became strong and scarred from the potter's tool. Clay dust worked its way under my fingernails and into the creases of my palms, marking me as someone who made things rather than simply managed them. The transformation felt symbolic of everything that was changing about my identity and priority. After 3 months of daily practice, I created my first piece that felt genuinely successful, a simple bowl with clean lines, and a glaze that captured something of the desert sunset in its swirled patterns of red and gold. Rosa held it up to the light, examining it with the serious attention she gave to all student work. "This is the real you," she said finally. "This is what your hands can do when they're not trying to be anything other than honest." The words hit me with unexpected force. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, I felt proud of something I'd accomplished entirely on my own merit. This bowl belonged to me in a way that nothing in my previous life ever had, created through my own effort and vision without Derek's approval or influence. As my confidence at the wheel grew, Rosa began trusting me with business responsibilities. I helped with inventory management, customer service, and eventually marketing, bringing my professional skills to bear on promoting the studio's classes and exhibitions. It felt good to be useful again, to contribute something meaningful to an enterprise I genuinely cared about. Unlike my corporate job, where success was measured in quarterly earnings and market share, the studio's success was visible in the joy on students' faces when they created something beautiful with their own hands. My living situation at Red Rock was always intended to be temporary, and after 4 months it was time to transition to independent housing. I'd saved enough from small jobs around Sedona to afford a tiny apartment above a bookstore in the Arts District, a space barely larger than my hospital room, but with windows that looked out toward the Red Rocks and a small balcony where I could watch the sunrise each morning. The apartment came furnished with the basics, but I found myself wanting to fill it with things I'd made myself rather than purchased. My first successful pottery pieces found homes on the kitchen shelf. A woven wall hanging I'd learned to make from Patricia before she left Red Rock brought color to the living room. A small painting I'd created during art therapy, no longer the angry chaos of my early attempts but something calmer and more hopeful, hung beside the window. Living alone for the first time in my adult life felt strange initially. In college, I'd had roommates, and Derek and I had moved in together shortly after graduation. I'd never had to learn the rhythms of solitude, never had to fill quiet evenings with activities of my own choosing. The silence that had felt oppressive during my first nights in Sedona now felt peaceful, full of possibility rather than emptiness. I established new routines that belonged entirely to me: morning coffee on the balcony while watching the light change on the rock, evening walks through the arts district, stopping to chat with other artists and shop owners who'd become part of my expanding community, weekend hiking trips to explore the network of trails that wound through the Red Rock formations, gradually building the physical strength and endurance I'd lost during months of bed rest. My friendship with Meredith Kim deepened during this period. She was a painter who'd moved to Sedona 5 years earlier after her divorce, seeking the same kind of fresh start I was pursuing. Unlike many of the spiritual seekers who'd been drawn to Sedona's reputation as an energy vortex, Meredith was practical and grounded, someone who'd found healing through hard work and community rather than crystals and chakras. "The thing about rebuilding your life," she told me one evening as we sat outside the coffee shop where she worked part-time, "is that you get to keep the parts that actually served you and throw out everything that was just conditioning or other people's expectation." Most people never get that opportunity because they're too afraid to let their old life completely fall apart. Her words resonated deeply. In losing everything I thought I'd wanted, I'd gained the freedom to discover what I actually need. The expensive clothes that had filled my walk-in closet in Millbrook had been replaced by practical work clothes that could withstand clay dust and desert hiking. The carefully coordinated furniture that had impressed Derek's colleagues had given way to simple pieces chosen for comfort and function rather than status. The elaborate social calendar filled with networking events and dinner parties had been replaced by genuine friendships built around shared interests rather than mutual advancement. Rosa began hinting that there might be a more permanent place for me at the studio. "Tommy's been talking about cutting back his hours," she mentioned one afternoon as we cleaned up after a particularly messy glazing session. "We could use someone with your business background to help expand our workshop offerings and maybe develop an online presence for selling pottery. It wouldn't make you rich, but it would be steady income doing something you seem to genuinely enjoy." The offer was tempting, but I wasn't ready to commit to anything permanent yet. Part of me was still processing the enormity of what I'd been through, still discovering who I was becoming in this new environment. The woman who'd boarded that plane to Arizona 8 months earlier had been running from the wreckage of her old life. The woman I was becoming felt more like she was running toward something, but I wasn't entirely sure what that something was yet. My relationship with Derek remained unresolved, a loose thread I wasn't ready to tie off but couldn't ignore indefinitely. I'd received updates from Margaret, my former hospital social worker who'd been helping me navigate the legal complexities of my situation. Derek had indeed sold our house and liquidated many of our shared assets, using my presumed death as justification for taking control of everything we'd built together. The bigamous marriages created interesting legal grounds for various types of litigation, if I chose to pursue them. "The question isn't whether you have a case," the lawyer Margaret had connected me with explained during a phone consultation. "The question is what you hope to achieve. Do you want financial compensation? Do you want him prosecuted for fraud? Do you want to expose the situation to his new wife? These are all possibilities, but you need to be clear about your goals before we proceed." I found myself surprisingly ambivalent about seeking revenge or even justice in any traditional sense. The Derek who'd abandoned his unconscious wife to build a new life with someone else felt like a character from someone else's story, connected to me only by shared history rather than current reality. The anger I'd felt in those first days after awakening had gradually transformed into something closer to pity. How empty must his life have been if he could so easily replace 12 years of marriage with a series of elaborate lies? More importantly, pursuing legal action would require me to re-engage with that world, to spend months or years focused on the past rather than building the future I was discovering in Sedona. The thought of depositions and court appearances and confrontations with Derek and Cassandra felt exhausting in a way that had nothing to do with the potential outcomes and everything to do with the energy it would require. One evening, while working late at the pottery studio on a series of pieces for an upcoming local art fair, I realized I'd gone an entire day without thinking about Derek or the life I'd lost. The recognition surprised me. For months, the betrayal had been the background soundtrack of my thoughts, a constant reminder of everything that had been taken from me. But gradually, as I'd built new routines and relationships and skills, That soundtrack had grown quieter until it was barely audible beneath the sounds of my actual life. The pottery wheel hummed beneath my hands as I centered a new piece of clay, feeling the familiar satisfaction of bringing order to chaos through pressure and patience. Outside the studio windows, the desert night was alive with sounds I'd learned to recognize, the call of coyotes in the distance and the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush. This was my life now, these sounds and sensations and relationships that belonged entirely to me. Rosa found me there close to midnight, still working by the light of the overhead lamps. "You know," she said, settling into a chair beside my wheel, "I've been running this studio for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone take to pottery the way you have. It's not just natural talent, though you have that. It's something deeper, like you needed to work with clay more than clay needed to be worked by you." Her observation felt true in a way I was still learning to articulate. The clay had become a metaphor for everything I was discovering about resilience and transformation. Like me, it could be completely broken down and reformed into something entirely new. Like me, it was strongest after being tested by fire. Like me, its final form was often more beautiful than what it had been originally intended to become. As I finally cleaned up my workspace and prepared to walk home through the quiet streets of Sedona, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the series of accidents and betrayals that had brought me to this place. The woman who'd been Derek's wife in Millbrook could never have imagined finding fulfillment in clay-covered hands and modest apartments and friendships built around shared vulnerability. That woman had been too busy performing success to discover what actual satisfaction felt like. The path back to my apartment took me past the bookstore where I rented my small space above, past the coffee shop where Meredith and I spent our morning hours, past the community center where I'd started volunteering with a literacy program for adults. Each familiar landmark felt like evidence of a life being built deliberately rather than by default, chosen rather than inherited or assigned. My phone buzzed with a text message from James, my former Red Rock housemate who'd recently moved to Colorado to start a wilderness therapy program. "Thinking of you tonight, and hoping Sedona is treating you well. You were right about the healing power of starting completely over. Some destruction is actually construction in disguise." His words lingered in my mind as I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment. Some destruction is actually construction in disguise. Maybe that was the most honest way to understand what had happened to me. Derek's betrayal hadn't just destroyed my old life, it had cleared the ground for something better to grow in its place. The coma that should have killed me had instead killed the version of myself that was slowly suffocating in a life that looked perfect from the outside but felt hollow at the core. Standing on my small balcony under a canopy of desert stars more brilliant than any I'd ever seen in Connecticut, I felt a deep sense of peace that had nothing to do with forgiveness or closure or any of the therapeutic milestones I'd been working toward. It was simpler than that, more fundamental. For the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, surrounded by people who knew and valued the real me, rather than some carefully constructed version designed to meet other people's expectations. The future stretched out ahead of me, uncertain but no longer frightening. There would be challenges, decisions to make about Derek and the legal complexities he'd created, choices about career and relationships, and where to build the next chapter of my life. But for now, it was enough to simply be present in this moment, in this place, in this body that had fought its way back from the edge of death to discover what it truly meant to be alive. Spring arrived in Sedona with an explosion of wildflowers that transformed the desert landscape into a tapestry of colors I'd never imagined possible in such an arid environment. The prickly pear cacti bloomed with bright yellow flowers, and the desert marigolds created carpets of gold between the red rocks. I'd been in Arizona for almost a year now, and the changing seasons had become markers of my own transformation in ways that felt deeply symbolic. My skills at the pottery wheel had progressed to the point where Rosa trusted me to teach beginning classes on weekends. Standing in front of a group of nervous first-timers, watching them struggle with the same frustrations I'd experienced months earlier, gave me a perspective on how far I'd traveled from that broken woman who'd arrived with nothing but hospital discharge papers and a one-way ticket. The students saw me as someone who belonged here, someone who'd mastered these skills through years of practice rather than months of desperate focus. "Remember that the clay is your partner, not your opponent," I told a particularly frustrated woman who kept fighting the wheel instead of working with it. Stop trying to force it into submission and start listening to what it wants to become. The advice felt natural coming from my lips, though I recognized it as wisdom I'd learned the hard way through countless failed attempts and Rosa's patient guidance. The woman's breakthrough came 20 minutes later when she finally relaxed her grip and let the clay respond to gentle pressure rather than aggressive control. The bowl that emerged was imperfect but beautiful, shaped by collaboration rather than domination. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at what her hands had created. "I haven't made anything this beautiful in 20 years, she whispered, and I understood exactly what she meant. Teaching became more than just a way to earn extra income. It was a form of healing that worked both directions, allowing me to share the hard-won knowledge I'd gained while helping others discover their own creative capability. Many of my students were going through their own life transitions, drawn to pottery classes as a way to work through divorce, retirement, loss, or simply the restless feeling that their current life wasn't quite right anymore. Margaret Foster, a recently retired nurse, became a regular in my Thursday evening classes. She'd spent 40 years caring for others and was struggling to figure out how to care for herself now that her days weren't structured around other people's needs. "I don't know who I am when I'm not taking care of someone else," she confided during one of our sessions. Her words resonated deeply with my own experience of discovering identity beyond the roles I'd played for others. Through pottery, Margaret began exploring parts of herself that had been dormant during decades of demanding hospital shifts. Her pieces were bold and experimental, incorporating unconventional glazes and textures that surprised even her. "I always thought I was practical and conservative," she said one evening, admiring a vase she'd created in swirling blues and purples. "Turns out I just never had permission to be anything else." The studio's reputation in the community continued to grow, partly through word of mouth from satisfied students, but also because Rosa and Tommy had given me increasing responsibility for marketing and community outreach. I'd created social media accounts that showcased not just finished pieces, but the process of creation, the meditative quality of working at the wheel, the satisfaction of pulling something beautiful from a lump of formless clay. Local restaurants began commissioning custom dinnerware, drawn by the unique character of handmade pieces compared to mass-produced alternatives. The Sedona Farmers Market invited us to set up a booth, and our Saturday sales became a significant source of revenue. I found myself negotiating with suppliers, managing inventory, and developing new product lines in ways that felt like a natural extension of my creative work rather than separate business responsibility. "You have a gift for making pottery accessible to people," Rosa observed one afternoon, as we prepared for a particularly large corporate workshop. A tech company from Phoenix was bringing their entire leadership team for a day-long team-building retreat focused on creativity and collaboration. "It's not just that you're a good teacher, you help people understand that making something with their hands connects them to parts of themselves they'd forgotten existed." The corporate workshop proved to be a turning point in several unexpected ways. The participants were high-achieving executives accustomed to controlling outcomes through strategic planning and aggressive execution. Watching them struggle with the unpredictability of clay, seeing their frustration gradually transform into wonder as they created their first successful pieces, reminded me of my own journey from rigid perfectionism to creative flexibility. During the lunch break, the company's CEO pulled me aside. "I've been watching how you work with people," she said. "You have this way of helping them get out of their own way that's really remarkable. Have you ever considered corporate consulting? We work with companies all over the Southwest, helping leadership teams develop better communication and collaboration skills. What you do with pottery could translate into powerful team-building experiences." The suggestion intrigued me in ways I hadn't expected. I'd assumed my corporate days were behind me forever, that the business skills I'd developed in my previous life were incompatible with the creative path I'd chosen. But the idea of combining both worlds, using pottery as a vehicle for helping teams work more effectively together, felt like a natural evolution of everything I'd been learning. "Think about it," the CEO continued, handing me her business card. "We could start with a few pilot programs, see how it goes. The market for experiential corporate training is huge, and what you're offering is completely unique. Most team-building activities are just games that people tolerate. What you do actually changes how people think about creativity and collaboration." That evening, I found myself sitting on my apartment balcony with a notebook, sketching out ideas for how pottery-based workshops could address specific corporate challenges. Communication breakdowns often stemmed from people's inability to listen to feedback without becoming defensive. Exactly the same problem that made the clay collapse when students tried to force it instead of responding to its need. Leadership development required learning to guide without controlling, to provide structure while allowing space for creativity and innovation. The more I thought about it, the more excited I became about the possibility. This wasn't about returning to my old corporate life, but about creating something entirely new that honored both my business experience and my creative growth. I could build a consulting practice that was authentically mine, based on principles I'd learned through my own transformation rather than theories I'd memorized from business school textbooks. Rosa and Tommy were enthusiastic when I pitched the idea to them the next morning. "We've always talked about expanding beyond the studio," Tommy said, "but we never quite knew what direction to take. This could be perfect, especially if you're willing to take the lead on developing it." The prospect of creating a new revenue stream that didn't require them to travel or change their own routines appealed to both of them. We spent the following weeks developing a business plan for what we decided to call Clay Leadership, a consulting practice that would offer pottery-based workshops for corporate teams, leadership development programs, and creative problem-solving sessions. I would handle the business development and facilitation while the studio would provide the space and equipment. It felt like the perfect blend of my corporate background and my newly discovered passion for helping people connect with their creativity. Our first official corporate client was a healthcare system in Phoenix, dealing with high turnover and communication problems between departments. The administrator who hired us was skeptical but desperate, willing to try anything that might help their teams work more effectively together. "Our doctors and nurses are brilliant at their jobs," she explained during our initial consultation, "but they can't seem to communicate with each other without everything turning into a territorial battle." The 2-day workshop we designed focused on collaboration and trust building through shared creative challenges. We started with simple exercises, having participants work together to center clay on the wheel, requiring them to coordinate their movements and communicate clearly about pressure and timing. The metaphors wrote themselves as teams that had been struggling with coordination in the workplace discovered they could create something beautiful together when they learned to listen to each other's cues. By the second day, we had emergency room doctors working alongside administrative staff to create collaborative sculptures, each person contributing their unique perspective to shared projects. The conversations that emerged during these sessions were revelatory, with long-standing conflicts being addressed through the safe space of creative work. People who had been avoiding each other for months found themselves laughing together over clay-covered hands and imperfect but heartfelt creations. The feedback from participants exceeded our wildest expectations. "I learned more about effective teamwork in 2 days with clay than I did in 5 years of traditional leadership training," wrote one department head in her evaluation. "There's something about working with your hands that bypasses all the intellectual defenses and gets straight to the heart of how people actually connect with each other." Word of our success spread quickly through the healthcare network, and soon we were fielding inquiries from other organizations throughout Arizona and beyond. I found myself traveling to Tucson, Flagstaff, and eventually as far as Denver and Salt Lake City, facilitating workshops that combined pottery instruction with organizational development principles. Each workshop taught me something new about the universal human need for creativity and connection. Whether I was working with tech startups struggling with innovation or manufacturing companies trying to improve safety communication, the core challenges were remarkably similar. People had forgotten how to play, how to experiment without fear of failure, how to value process over outcome. The clay became a vehicle for rediscovering these essential capabilities. My personal pottery practice evolved alongside my consulting work. The pieces I created during evening hours at the studio became more sophisticated, incorporating techniques I'd learned from visiting artists and experimental approaches I'd developed through my own exploration. I started entering pieces in juried exhibitions, first locally and then regionally, building a reputation as an artist rather than just a teacher or facilitator. The first time one of my pieces was accepted into a prestigious show in Santa Fe, I felt a pride that was entirely different from any professional accomplishment I'd achieved in my previous career. This recognition was based purely on the merit of work I'd created with my own hands, not on my ability to manage other people's projects or navigate corporate politics. The piece that was selected, a large vessel with a glazed surface that captured the colors of a Sedona sunset, represented hundreds of hours of practice and experimentation. Rosa insisted on driving with me to the opening reception, claiming she wanted to see how real art people behaved at these events. The gallery was filled with collectors, critics, and artists whose work I'd admired from afar. Standing next to my piece, watching strangers examine it with serious attention, discussing its technical merits and emotional impact, felt surreal in the best possible way. "Excuse me, are you the artist?" A distinguished older man approached, gesturing toward my vessel. "I'm particularly drawn to this piece. There's something about the surface treatment that suggests geological time, like you've captured thousands of years of desert formation in a single moment." His appreciation was knowledgeable and genuine, and I found myself engaged in a conversation about glazing techniques and artistic inspiration that lasted nearly an hour. By the end of the evening, 3 people had inquired about commissioning pieces, and a gallery owner from Phoenix had expressed interest in representing my work. The financial possibilities were modest compared to my former corporate salary, but the personal satisfaction was immeasurable. I was building a reputation based on creative vision and technical skill, creating beauty that brought joy to others while expressing something authentic about my own experience and perspective. The success of both my consulting practice and my art career created new choices I'd never anticipated having to make. Demand for clay leadership workshops was growing faster than I could accommodate while maintaining my teaching responsibilities at the studio and my personal art practice. Several organizations had expressed interest in bringing me on as a permanent consultant, offering steady income and benefits that would eliminate the uncertainty of freelance work. Meanwhile, the gallery interest in my pottery was creating opportunities to exhibit and sell work at a level that could potentially support me as a full-time artist. The idea of focusing entirely on creation, of spending my days at the wheel developing my craft and exploring new techniques, held tremendous appeal. But it would mean stepping away from the teaching and consulting work that had become deeply meaningful to me. The decision felt familiar in its complexity but entirely different in its foundation. When I'd faced major life choices during my marriage to Derek, the considerations had been about financial security, social status, and maintaining the lifestyle we'd built together. Now the choice was between different forms of meaningful work, different ways of expressing creativity, and contributing to community. There was no wrong answer, only different paths toward fulfillment. Meredith helped me think through the options during one of our regular hiking excursions into the Red Rocks. We'd climbed to a favorite spot overlooking the valley, where the view stretched for miles in every direction, and the silence was broken only by the wind through the juniper tree. "The beautiful thing about where you are now," she said, "is that you get to choose based on what actually feeds your soul rather than what looks good on paper or what other people expect." Her words reminded me of how different this decision-making process was from anything I'd experienced in my previous life. Then, choices had been filtered through Derek's opinions, social expectations, and financial considerations that prioritized security over satisfaction. Now I was free to prioritize meaning, creativity, and personal growth in ways that would have been impossible when my identity was so tightly bound to external validation. As autumn approached, marking my second year in Sedona, I found myself reflecting on the woman who'd arrived here broken and desperate, clutching the remnants of a life that had been built on foundations she'd never questioned. That woman had been accomplished in many ways, successful by conventional measures, but she'd been living someone else's definition of a good life. The woman I was becoming had fewer material possessions, but infinitely more agency over her choices and direction. The pottery studio had become more than just a workplace. It was a sanctuary where transformation happened daily, where people discovered capabilities they'd never known they possessed. My role there had evolved from desperate student to confident teacher to innovative partner, creating programs that served the community while building a sustainable business. The consulting practice had exceeded every expectation, proving that it was possible to honor both creative passion and entrepreneurial ambition. Most importantly, I'd built a life that belonged entirely to me. The relationships I'd formed were based on genuine connection rather than social obligation. The work I did emerged from authentic passion rather than external pressure. The choices I made reflected my actual values rather than inherited expectations. For the first time in my adult life, there was no gap between who I was and who I appeared to be. Standing at my pottery wheel late one evening, centering clay while the desert night settled around the studio, I realized I'd stopped thinking about Derek entirely, except when legal matters required attention. The betrayal that had once defined my daily experience had become simply part of my origin story, the catalyst that had led to everything meaningful in my current life. I felt grateful for the destruction that had cleared the way for this reconstruction, for the ending that had enabled this beginning. The future stretched ahead, filled with possibilities I was still discovering. There would be more workshops to facilitate, more art to create, more students to guide through their own creative awakening. There would be new challenges and opportunities I couldn't yet imagine, decisions to make about love and partnership and family that would be entirely my own to determine. But for now, it was enough to be present in this moment, creating something beautiful with my hands, while surrounded by the evidence of a life built deliberately, authentically from the ground up. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, forwarded from the hospital where I'd awakened 2 years earlier. The return address made my stomach clench with recognition even before I opened the envelope. Law offices of Patterson, Mackenzie & Associates, Derek's longtime legal firm. Inside was a formal notice requesting my presence at a deposition regarding marital assets and fraudulent death claims, with a court date scheduled for the following month. I sat on my apartment balcony reading the legal document twice, trying to process what it meant. According to the papers, Derek was claiming that my disappearance and failure to contact him after awakening constituted abandonment of our marriage. He was seeking full ownership of assets he'd liquidated during my coma, arguing that his actions had been legally justified given my presumed death status. Most audaciously, he was countersuing for emotional distress, claiming my resurrection had caused him psychological trauma and damaged his reputation in the community. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. The man who'd committed bigamy while I fought for my life was now positioning himself as the victim, seeking legal protection for his fraud while painting me as the abandoning spouse. It was a masterpiece of manipulation that would have been impressive if it weren't so personally devastating. Rosa found me still sitting with the papers an hour later when she arrived to open the studio. "Bad news from Connecticut?" she asked, noting my expression. When I handed her the documents, her weathered face darkened with anger. "This is what happens when selfish people get scared," she said bluntly. "They attack first and hope confusion will work in their favor." The legal situation forced me to confront questions I'd been avoiding for 2 years. My Connecticut attorney, recommended by Margaret, explained that Derek's strategy was likely designed to pressure me into a settlement that would allow him to keep most of our shared assets in exchange for avoiding criminal charges for bigamy. "He's gambling that you won't want the publicity and hassle of a protracted legal battle," she said during our phone consultation. "The question is whether he's right about that." I found myself in the strange position of having to decide how much energy I wanted to invest in fighting for a past I'd already moved beyond. The house in Millbrook, the investment accounts, the accumulated possessions of 12 years of marriage, all felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The woman who'd lived in that house and cared about those things had died in that car accident, as surely as if the impact had been fatal. But the principle of the matter was harder to dismiss. Derek's actions had been criminal, not just personally betraying but legally fraudulent. Allowing him to profit from that fraud while positioning himself as the injured party felt like enabling a pattern of behavior that would likely harm others in the future. If he could successfully gaslight the legal system into seeing him as the victim, what would prevent him from doing something similar to his next wife when their relationship became inconvenient? Tommy's perspective was characteristically direct when I sought his advice. "The question isn't whether you need the money or want the hassle," he said during one of our evening conversations at the studio. "The question is whether you can live with yourself if you let him get away with it. Some battles are worth fighting not because you need to win, but because someone needs to draw the line. My Sedona community rallied around me in ways that highlighted how different these relationships were from the superficial connections I'd maintained in Connecticut. Meredith offered to manage my pottery classes while I dealt with legal preparations. Several of my corporate consulting clients wrote letters attesting to my character and professional competence. Even Margaret Foster, my retired nurse student, insisted on helping research Connecticut law regarding bigamy and fraud. "You've built something beautiful here," Margaret said one evening as we worked together in the studio, her hands shaping clay while we talked through legal strategy. "Don't let his attempt to drag you backward make you forget how far forward you've come. Fight him if you need to, but remember that your real life is here now, not in whatever courtroom drama he's trying to create." The preparation for returning to Connecticut felt surreal. I hadn't been back east since boarding that plane to Arizona with nothing but hospital discharge papers and desperate hope. The clothes I'd worn then no longer fit the body I'd built through physical labor and desert hike. The woman who'd fled Connecticut had been soft and frightened, defined entirely by loss. The woman preparing to return was lean and strong, defined by what she'd created rather than what had been taken from her. Rosa insisted on accompanying me, claiming she'd always wanted to see autumn in New England, but really offering moral support disguised as tourism. "Besides," she said with a grin, "I want to get a look at this Derek character. I'm curious what kind of man thinks he can erase a woman's existence, and then play victim when she refuses to stay erased." The flight from Phoenix to Hartford felt like traveling not just across geography but through time, returning to a version of myself I'd thought was buried forever. But as the plane descended through October clouds toward familiar New England landscape, I realized I wasn't the same person returning to an unchanged world. I was a fundamentally different woman bringing new strength to face old ghosts. Our rental car drove through Millbrook just as the autumn foliage reached peak color, the maples and oaks blazing with reds and golds that reminded me why I'd once loved this landscape. But the beauty felt distant now, like admiring a photograph of somewhere I'd visited long ago, rather than experiencing the emotional homecoming I'd expected. This place belonged to my past, not my present. The house Derek and I had shared looked smaller than I remembered, its pristine lawn and carefully maintained facade seeming almost twee compared to the dramatic desert landscapes that had become home. A young family now lived there, their children's toys scattered across the yard we'd kept immaculate for appearances. Seeing evidence of life and joy in a space where I'd grown increasingly hollow felt oddly healing, as if the house itself had been liberated from our sterile perfectionism. My attorney's office in downtown Hartford was exactly what I'd expected. All dark wood and leather-bound law books designed to intimidate and impress. But after 2 years of desert simplicity, the ostentatious displays of wealth and power felt theatrical rather than authoritative. These were props in a performance I no longer felt compelled to participate in with reverence or anxiety. Derek arrived for our first meeting with his legal team exactly on time, dressed in the expensive suit armor that had once impressed me but now seemed like costume jewelry. He'd gained weight since I'd last seen him, his face puffy in ways that suggested stress eating or drinking. The confidence that had once attracted me was still there, but it felt brittle now, performance rather than genuine self-assurance. His reaction to seeing me was carefully controlled but couldn't hide his shock at my transformation. The designer wife he'd abandoned had been replaced by a woman with calloused hands, sun-streaked hair, and the kind of physical presence that came from meaningful work rather than gym membership. I was stronger than I'd ever been, more confident in my own skin, more comfortable with who I'd become than who I'd been expected to be. "Alexis," he said with the smooth charm that had once made my heart flutter, "you look different, healthy. I'm glad to see you've recovered so well from your accident." The calculated warmth in his voice was designed to establish the narrative that this was a friendly reunion between former spouses, rather than a confrontation between victim and perpetrator. "I've gone back to my maiden name, and yes, I've recovered completely. Better than completely, actually. The accident and everything that followed taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise." My voice was steady, free of the anger or hurt he was probably expecting. I wasn't performing for him anymore, wasn't trying to prove anything or win his approval. The mediation session that followed was a masterclass in manipulation and gaslight. Derek's attorney painted a picture of a devoted husband driven to desperate measures by his wife's apparent death, forced to make difficult decisions about shared assets in order to move forward with his life. My prolonged silence after awakening was characterized as cruel abandonment, proof that I'd never truly valued our marriage or cared about the pain my disappearance had caused. Derek himself played the role of wounded party with Academy Award precision, describing the trauma of believing I was dead, the guilt he'd carried about our last fight, the difficulty of learning to love again after such devastating loss. If I hadn't lived through the reality of his betrayal, I might have been moved by his performance. He was genuinely talented at rewriting history to cast himself as the protagonist of every story, but I'd learned something during my time in the desert that Derek had never understood. Truth wasn't a performance or a negotiation, it simply was what it was, regardless of how skillfully someone tried to reshape it for their benefit. The facts were straightforward: he'd committed bigamy while I was unconscious, liquidated our shared assets without legal authority, and lied to multiple women about his marital status. No amount of emotional manipulation could change those realities. When my turn came to speak, I kept my statement simple and factual. I understand that Derek faced difficult circumstances when I was in a coma, I said calmly, but those circumstances didn't give him legal authority to dissolve our marriage, liquidate our assets, or enter into fraudulent marriages with other women. His emotional distress, however genuine, doesn't justify criminal behavior or absolve him of legal responsibility for that behavior. The contrast between our approaches was stark. Where Derek had offered elaborate emotional narratives designed to justify his actions, I presented simple facts that required no justification. Where he'd tried to control the conversation through charm and manipulation, I remained centered and grounded in truth. The skills I'd learned working with Clay, staying present and responsive rather than controlling and forceful, served me well in this very different kind of challenge. His attorney tried various tactics to unsettle me, questioning my decision to leave Connecticut without contacting Derek, suggesting that my new life in Arizona proved I'd never truly been committed to our marriage. But their arguments felt hollow because they were based on the assumption that I should have prioritized Derek's feelings over my own healing and recovery. That assumption might have been valid for the woman I'd been, but it held no power over the woman I'd become. During a break in the proceedings, Derek approached me in the hallway with Rosa maintaining watchful distance nearby. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," he said in the intimate tone he'd once used to convince me to go along with his preferences. "We had 12 good years together. Can't we find a way to end this that honors what we built rather than destroying it?" His appeal might have worked on the old Natalie, the one who'd been trained to prioritize peace over principle, to smooth over conflicts rather than address them directly. But the woman he was speaking to had been forged in the fire of complete loss and rebuilding. I understood now that some things were worth destroying if they were built on rotten foundation. What we built was built on my willingness to make myself smaller to accommodate your needs, I replied evenly. That foundation was never solid, Derek. Maybe this destruction is what it always needed. His face darkened at my refusal to be charmed or manipulated back into compliance. The mask of wounded devotion slipped enough to reveal the calculating anger beneath. "You think you're so enlightened now with your little pottery hobby and your desert spirituality," he sneered, his voice taking on the cutting edge. "I remembered from our worst fights. But you're still the same needy woman who couldn't exist without someone else defining her worth. You've just traded me for a new set of people to perform for." His words were designed to wound, to activate old insecurities and self-doubts that had once made me question my own perceptions and needs. But they bounced off me like arrows hitting stone. The woman he was trying to hurt no longer existed. The woman standing before him had learned her worth through her own hands and effort, had built confidence through genuine achievement rather than external validation. "You're right that I couldn't exist without someone else defining my worth," I agreed calmly. "That's exactly why I had to lose everything to discover who I actually was underneath all those borrowed definitions. Thank you for showing me how hollow that foundation was." I couldn't have rebuilt on solid ground without understanding how rotten the original structure had become. My gratitude clearly wasn't the reaction he'd expected. Derek stared at me as if I'd started speaking a foreign language, unable to process a response that didn't fit his script for how this confrontation was supposed to unfold. He needed me to be angry or hurt or desperate for his approval. My genuine appreciation for the lessons his betrayal had taught me broke his understanding of the power dynamics between us. The legal proceedings continued for 3 more days, with Derek's team presenting increasingly desperate arguments for why his fraud should be excused and my silence should be punished. They brought character witnesses who testified to Derek's standing in the community, his business success, his reputation as a devoted husband before my abandonment. They painted elaborate pictures of his emotional trauma and financial hardship caused by my disappearance and resurrection. But facts remained facts, regardless of emotional packaging. The evidence of bigamy was undeniable, the unauthorized liquidation of assets was thoroughly documented. The fraudulent death claims were supported by paper trails that Derek's own attorney had helped create. No amount of character testimony could transform criminal behavior into justified response to difficult circumstances. My legal team presented our case with surgical precision, focusing on documentation rather than emotion, law rather than narrative. We had bank records, marriage certificates, social media posts, insurance claims, and witness testimony that painted a clear picture of deliberate fraud rather than confused greed. The contrast between our fact-based approach and Derek's emotion-based defense highlighted the fundamental difference between truth and performance. On the final day of depositions, Cassandra Blake Whitman appeared in the courthouse hallway, clearly distressed and clutching what appeared to be divorce papers. She was smaller than she'd looked in photographs, more fragile, with the kind of porcelain beauty that required careful maintenance. Seeing her in person, I felt unexpected sympathy for this woman who'd been as much Derek's victim as I had been. Though in different ways. "Are you Natalie Harper?" she asked hesitantly, approaching where Rosa and I sat waiting for the afternoon session to begin. "I'm Cassandra. I think we need to talk." Her voice carried the brittleness of someone whose world had recently exploded in ways she was still trying to understand. Rosa squeezed my hand supportively as Cassandra sat down across from us, her hands trembling slightly as she organized her thoughts. "I need you to know that I had no idea about you," she began. "Derek told me his first wife had died in a car accident 2 years before we met. He showed me newspaper clippings about the accident, medical records about your condition. I thought I was marrying a widower who'd gone through terrible tragedy." Her pain was genuine and heartbreaking. This woman had been manipulated as thoroughly as I had been, built her hopes and dreams around a man who'd created an elaborate fiction to serve his own needs. She'd believed herself legally married, had made decisions about her future based on lies as comprehensive as they were cruel. When his attorney contacted me last week to explain that our marriage wasn't legal, that you were alive and pursuing these claims, I felt like my entire reality was dissolving. She continued. "Everything I thought I knew about Derek, about our relationship, about my own life for the past 2 years has been lies. I don't even know who I am anymore if the person I've been loving doesn't actually exist." I recognized the devastation in her voice because I'd lived through my own version of that complete disorientation. "I'm so sorry you're going through this," I said sincerely. "Derek's betrayal of you is just as real and just as wrong as his betrayal of me. You deserve so much better than the lies he built your relationship on." Cassandra's eyes filled with tears as she pulled out her phone, showing me photos from their wedding ceremonies, their travels together, their shared home. "Look at these pictures," she said. "Look how happy we look. Was any of it real?" How do you tell the difference between genuine love and skilled manipulation when someone is talented enough at lying? The question cut to the heart of everything I'd been processing for the past 2 years. "I think the real moments were real for you," I said carefully. "Your feelings were genuine even if his were calculated. The joy you felt, the hope you had for your future together, the love you gave him, all of that was authentic. The fact that he didn't deserve it doesn't make it less valuable or meaningful." Rosa listened to our conversation with the kind of fierce protectiveness she showed toward all her pottery students who were learning to trust themselves again after being broken. "You're both survivors of the same man's selfishness," she said bluntly. The question now is what you're going to do with that survival. Are you going to let him define your worth by his lies? Or are you going to rebuild on foundations he can't touch? Cassandra's decision to file for divorce and support my legal claims transformed the entire dynamic of the proceeding. Her testimony about Derek's deception was devastating to his credibility, particularly when she produced evidence of continued lies he'd told her even after my awakening became public knowledge. The man who'd positioned himself as a victim of my cruelty was revealed as a calculated manipulator who'd victimized multiple women through elaborate fraud. The settlement negotiations that followed were swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence of criminal behavior and the prospect of prosecution for bigamy, fraud, and perjury, Derek's legal team advised him to accept terms that restored most of our shared assets to me while avoiding jail time. The money felt less important than the acknowledgement that his actions had been wrong, that my perspective on what had happened was valid and legally supported. Standing outside the courthouse on a crisp October afternoon, watching Derek emerge looking defeated and diminished, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel: pity. This man who'd once seemed so powerful and confident was revealed as someone so insecure and hollow that he'd rather destroy multiple women's lives than face his own emptiness. The anger I'd carried for so long dissolved into something closer to sadness for the smallness of spirit that had driven such cruelty. Rosa and I flew back to Arizona the next evening, leaving behind the autumn colors and legal complexities for the stark beauty and simple truths of the desert. As our plane lifted off from Hartford, I felt the last threads connecting me to my old life finally snap. Not with trauma or regret, but with gratitude for everything that connection had taught me about resilience, authenticity, and the difference between a life lived for others and a life lived from the heart. The woman returning to Sedona carried more than legal vindication and recovered assets. She carried the deep knowledge that she could face any challenge that arose, could rebuild from any destruction, could trust herself to make decisions based on her own values rather than other people's expectations. The pottery studio, the consulting practice, the artistic recognition, the community of friends, all of it was built on foundations that belonged entirely to her. My apartment balcony had never looked more welcoming than it did that first morning back, with the red rocks glowing in the sunrise, and the desert stretching endlessly toward horizons that promised continued growth and discovery. I had legal closure now, financial security, and the satisfaction of having stood up for principle when it would have been easier to walk away. But more importantly, I had confirmation that the life I'd built in Arizona was real, valuable, and completely my own creation. The money from the settlement would eliminate any financial pressure to choose between my consulting work and my art practice. I could develop both at whatever pace felt right, could make decisions based on passion and purpose rather than survival necessity. The freedom was intoxicating in the best possible way, like being handed the keys to a future with unlimited possibilities. But the most valuable thing I brought back from Connecticut wasn't money or legal vindication. It was the absolute certainty that I would never again allow anyone to define my worth, direct my choices, or limit my possibilities. The woman who'd awakened from that coma had been weak and lost, dependent on others for direction and support. The woman who'd faced down Derek's manipulation and legal aggression was strong, centered, and unshakably confident in her own judgment and capability. 6 months after returning from Connecticut, I stood in the main gallery of the Sedona Arts Center, surrounded by 43 pieces of pottery that represented 3 years of intensive learning, growth, and creative exploration. The exhibition, titled Phoenix Rising: Ceramic Meditations on Rebirth, was my first solo show, and the opening reception had drawn a crowd that included collectors from Phoenix and Santa Fe, fellow artists, my corporate consulting clients, and the entire community that had become my chosen family. The centerpiece of the exhibition was a large installation called Dissolution and Reconstruction, a series of vessels that began with perfect traditional forms and gradually became more abstract and experimental, culminating in pieces that incorporated elements of destruction, cracks that had been highlighted with gold in the Japanese tradition of kintsugi. The metaphor was intentional and deeply personal, representing the journey from my former perfectionist existence, through the shattering of everything I'd thought I wanted, to the golden healing that had made me stronger and more beautiful than I'd ever been before. Rosa stood beside me as we watched people move through the space, their conversations revealing genuine engagement with the work rather than polite social obligation. "You know," she said quietly, "when you first walked into our studio, I could see the artist in you even though you couldn't see it yourself. But I never imagined you'd develop such a distinctive voice so quickly. These pieces aren't just technically accomplished, they're saying something important about resilience and transformation." The validation from someone whose opinion I respected more than any art critic felt profound. Rosa had witnessed my entire journey from desperate beginner to confident artist, had guided me through the technical challenges, and encouraged me through the inevitable failures that preceded breakthrough. Her assessment carried the weight of someone who'd seen hundreds of students attempt this path, and understood what genuine artistic development looked like. Patricia Chen, the neurologist who'd overseen my recovery, had driven down from Phoenix for the opening, bringing with her a perspective that added layers of meaning to the exhibition. "I've seen many patients recover from traumatic brain injuries," she told a cluster of gallery visitors who'd gathered around one of my more complex pieces, "but I've never seen anyone transform that experience into something this beautiful and meaningful." This work doesn't just represent personal healing, it offers hope to anyone facing their own reconstruction process. The financial success of the exhibition exceeded everyone's expectations, including mine. By the end of the opening reception, red dots indicating sales marked more than half the pieces, with several collectors commissioning additional work and a museum in Tucson expressing interest in acquiring pieces for their permanent collection. The recognition was gratifying, but more importantly, it confirmed that I'd developed something worth sharing with the world, a perspective and skill set that could support me financially while contributing something meaningful to the cultural conversation. Thomas Garrett, the gallery owner from Phoenix who'd first shown interest in my work, approached me near the end of the evening with a proposal that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. "I'd like to represent your work exclusively," he said. "Not just occasional pieces, but a partnership where we develop your career systematically. You're ready for museum exhibitions, major collectors, perhaps even international exposure. The question is whether you're ready for that level of commitment to your art practice." His offer represented everything I'd dreamed of when I'd first started taking pottery seriously, but accepting it would require difficult choices about the other aspects of my life I'd grown to love. Exclusive representation meant producing work consistently for his gallery's exhibitions and client base, which would likely mean scaling back my teaching responsibilities and corporate consulting practice. The success I'd built in both areas would have to be subordinated to the demands of developing my reputation as a serious artist. The decision felt different from any choice I'd faced in my previous life because all the options were appealing rather than limited. I wasn't choosing between survival and security, or trying to balance my needs against someone else's expectations. I was choosing between different forms of meaningful work, different ways of expressing creativity, and contributing to community. The luxury of such choices still felt miraculous to someone who'd awakened from a coma with literally nothing but the kindness of strangers. Meredith found me on the gallery's patio during a quiet moment near the end of the reception, needing air and space to process the evening's overwhelming success. "Feeling the weight of possibilities?" she asked, settling into the chair beside me with 2 glasses of wine from the reception. I remember when my first big break came along, feeling paralyzed by having to choose between different versions of success. "It's a wonderful problem to have," I acknowledged, "but it's still a problem. Every choice means closing off other paths, and I've grown attached to the teaching and consulting work in ways I didn't expect. Those aren't just sources of income anymore. They're ways of helping people discover their own resilience and creativity. Giving them up feels like abandoning a responsibility." Meredith's smile held the wisdom of someone who'd navigated similar crossroads. "Who says you have to give them up entirely? Maybe the question isn't which path to choose, but how to integrate them all into something uniquely yours. You've never been someone who fits neatly into traditional categories anyway." Her words sparked a possibility I hadn't considered. What if success didn't require choosing between different aspects of my work, but finding ways to weave them together into something more comprehensive and impactful. The pottery, the teaching, the corporate consulting, and now the gallery representation could potentially support and enhance each other rather than competing for my time and energy. Over the following weeks, I worked with Thomas to develop a representation agreement that preserved my autonomy while supporting my artistic development. Instead of exclusive control over all my work, he would handle gallery exhibitions and collector relationships, while I maintained the freedom to continue my teaching and consulting practice. The arrangement was unconventional, but it reflected the reality that my art was inseparable from my work helping others discover their own creativity and resilience. The compromise proved to be inspired rather than limited. My corporate consulting work began incorporating more sophisticated artistic elements as I gained confidence in my abilities, and the stories of transformation from those workshops became inspiration for new pottery series. The teaching continued to ground me in the fundamentals while challenging me to articulate what I'd learned in ways that could help others. The gallery representation provided the professional validation and financial foundation that allowed me to take greater creative risks. My second year as a represented artist brought opportunities I'd never imagined possible. A prestigious craft museum in North Carolina acquired 3 pieces for their permanent collection, and a corporate client commissioned a large installation for their headquarters lobby. Art magazines began featuring my work in articles about contemporary ceramics, and I was invited to teach workshops at national conferences for art educators and therapists. The recognition felt surreal at times, particularly when I received an invitation to participate in an international ceramics exhibition in Japan. The country that had developed the kintsugi tradition of highlighting cracks with gold, the philosophy that had so deeply influenced my artistic development, wanted to include my work in a show exploring global interpretations of beauty and broken. The symbolic resonance was almost too perfect to believe. Standing in my studio late one evening, preparing pieces for shipment to Tokyo, I found myself reflecting on the strange circuitous path that had led to this moment. The woman who'd been Derek's wife in Connecticut could never have imagined finding fulfillment in clay-covered hands, and modest apartments, and friendships built around shared vulnerability. That woman had been too busy performing success to discover what actual satisfaction felt like. The accident that should have killed me had instead killed the version of myself that was slowly suffocating in a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow at the core. Derek's betrayal, which should have destroyed me completely, had instead cleared the ground for something better to grow in its place. Every loss had contained the seeds of unexpected gain. Every ending had enabled a beginning I couldn't have planned or predicted. A soft knock on the studio door interrupted my reverie. David Martinez, a photographer and sculptor who'd become part of my inner circle over the past year, stood in the doorway with coffee and the easy smile that had first caught my attention during a community art event 6 months earlier. Our relationship had developed slowly, built on shared creative passion and mutual respect rather than neediness or convenience. "Thought you might need caffeine for the late-night packing session," he said, settling onto a stool beside my work table. David understood the demands of artistic practice in ways Derek never had, supported my ambitions without trying to direct them, celebrated my successes without feeling diminished by them. Our partnership felt like true collaboration rather than performance or accommodation. "I keep thinking about that woman who woke up in the hospital 3 years ago," I told him as we worked together to carefully wrap each piece for international shipping. "She was so broken, so lost, so convinced her life was over. If someone had told her she'd be sending pottery to Japan for an exhibition about finding beauty in brokenness, she would have thought they were delusional." David's hands stilled on the bubble wrap he'd been adjusting around a delicate vessel. "Maybe that's the point," he said thoughtfully. "Maybe we can't become who we're meant to be until everything we think we're supposed to be gets stripped away. Your accident and Derek's betrayal didn't destroy you, they revealed you. The strength and creativity and resilience were always there, just buried under expectations and fear." His words resonated with everything I'd learned about transformation through clay. The pottery wheel demanded complete presence and authentic response, punished any attempt to force outcomes, through willpower alone. The most beautiful pieces emerged when I stopped trying to control the process and started collaborating with the material, allowing it to teach me what was possible, rather than imposing my preconceptions about what should happen. The same principle had governed my entire reconstruction process. The most meaningful changes had come not from strategic planning or determined effort, but from staying open to unexpected possibilities and trusting that forward movement didn't always look like progress. Sometimes it looked like destruction, dissolution, starting over from nothing with only hope and willingness to guide the way. The Japanese exhibition opening took place on a crisp spring morning in Kyoto, in a gallery surrounded by traditional gardens that seemed to exemplify the aesthetic philosophy my work had been exploring. Standing among pieces created by artists from dozens of countries, all interpreting the theme of finding beauty in brokenness, I felt part of a global conversation about resilience and renewal that transcended individual experience. The curator, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, explained to the gathered audience how the ancient practice of kintsugi had emerged from a practical need to repair broken pottery, but had evolved into a philosophical statement about the value of imperfection and the beauty of visible healing. These contemporary artists, she said, gesturing toward the diverse works surrounding us, are extending that tradition into new materials and contexts, showing us that breakage and repair are part of every human story. My pieces were displayed in a section of the gallery that emphasized transformation through trauma, surrounded by works from artists who'd found creative voice through various forms of loss and recovery. The context heightened the meaning of individual pieces, while creating a larger narrative about the universality of breakdown and rebuilding. Seeing my work in dialogue with other artists' interpretations of similar themes felt like coming home to a community I'd been seeking without knowing it existed. The international attention generated by the exhibition led to invitations from galleries in Europe and Australia, opportunities to teach workshops in universities and art centers, and collaborations with other artists exploring therapeutic applications of creative practice. My work had evolved beyond personal expression into something that could serve others facing their own reconstruction processes. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came in a letter from Cassandra, Derek's former fake wife, who'd been following my artistic career through social media. She'd moved to California after their divorce, was working as a therapist specializing in trauma recovery, and had incorporated art therapy into her practice, based partly on what she'd learned from observing my transformation. Seeing how you turned the worst thing that ever happened to you into the foundation for something so beautiful and meaningful has changed how I think about my own healing, she wrote. I'm not grateful for Derek's lies or the pain they caused, but I'm grateful for the strength I discovered I had when everything fell apart. Thank you for showing me that survival isn't enough. We can actually thrive in ways we never imagined possible. Her words brought tears to my eyes because they captured something essential about the journey I'd taken. The goal had never been to return to who I'd been before the accident and betrayal. That woman, comfortable as she'd seemed, had been living a life that was fundamentally unsustainable, built on foundations that couldn't withstand real pressure. The goal had been to become someone who could not only survive catastrophic loss, but transform it into fuel for unprecedented growth. Standing in my Sedona studio 5 years after awakening from that coma, surrounded by work that represented thousands of hours of learning and creation, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with finished projects or achieved goals. It was the completion that comes from aligning outward life with inner truth, from discovering work that serves both personal fulfillment and community benefit, from building relationships based on authenticity rather than performance. The pottery wheel hummed beneath my hands as I centered a fresh piece of clay, feeling the familiar satisfaction of bringing order to chaos through pressure and patience. Outside the studio windows, the desert night was alive with sounds I'd learned to recognize and love, the call of coyotes in the distance and the rustle of small creatures moving through the brush. This was my life now, these sounds and sensations and relationships that belonged entirely to me. The woman who'd been Derek's wife in Connecticut was gone as completely as if the car accident had been fatal, but the woman who'd emerged from that destruction was more vital, more creative, more genuinely happy than her predecessor had ever been. Sometimes the cruelest actions yield the greatest gifts, and sometimes what looks like ending is actually beginning in disguise. The clay responded to my touch with the kind of cooperative partnership I'd learned to trust complete. Whatever emerged from this session would be shaped by collaboration rather than control, would become beautiful through honest expression rather than manufactured perfection. Just like the life I'd built from the wreckage of everything I'd thought I wanted, just like the future that continued to unfold with possibilities I was still discovering. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.